I was telling Deacon Reardon that one of the great joys of being a pastor is to see the couples who were married here at Our Lady of Lourdes, whether I was part of their marriage or not, and they're present here, and in many cases they've had children and are raising their children, and they're here at Mass. It gives great joy, and Deacon and I both share this belief as well. The beating heart of the Catholic Church is in the parish. It's not 777 Forest Avenue in St. Paul where the Chancery is. It's not the Vatican in Rome. Those places are important to the life of a church, but it's here where the people of God meet the living God in grace and in worship of Him. The other thing that gives great joy to me as a pastor is when parishioners say to me, "How can I help?" That's what Joe Tamburino did many months ago, and I finally got around with him, connecting him to Jacob Benda, and I thought he would be a wonderful lector, and indeed he is. Ellen Beecher said the same thing to me the other day. How can I help? I want to get more involved. That warms the heart of a pastor, and many of you have done that. The gifts that we're given are meant to build up the community. They're never for our own right or aggrandizement, but always to build up the community. And those gifts are given not to be put under a bushel basket, but for service. And we all have gifts. God has gifted all of us uniquely to build up the communities around us. My mind and heart go back to that horrific day 20 years ago and the days following. I was in my final year at seminary, St. Paul Seminary in St. Paul, and was coming from breakfast, and there was a bit of a noise that went through the group as the word spread, and we saw the second plane go into the towers and knew that something very evil was afoot. Later that day, we decided to continue the plans to celebrate one of the seminarian's birthdays as he was born on 9/11. And I remember it was good to be with friends at that time. Similarly, it was good to be with parishioners and friends yesterday as we gathered in the courtyard. And a number of people told stories about where they were. One man in Philadelphia needing to get a ride to meet his wife in Indianapolis, knowing he had that intuition that there'd be no way of flying for the next several days. Another woman told a story about her husband just getting the sense 3 weeks after 9/11 that the family needed to go to New York to be supportive of that city, and she was somewhat dismayed as she had a 1-year-old boy, and they all traveled to New York. I'll never forget the Friday after the 9/11 attacks where the Cathedral of St. Paul, which was my teaching parish at the time, and I believe Deacon Reardon was the deacon there at the time as well, held a interfaith prayer service. And Archbishop Flynn had an extraordinary gift for preaching, unlike any other Catholic clergy person I had ever seen. In fact, the first time I ever heard him preach, I didn't know he was the coadjutor archbishop waiting to succeed Archbishop Roach. It was Christmas at the cathedral. I was in law school, and I remember this fairly small man, diminutive man, getting up into that pulpit and absolutely rocking his homily. And I thought to myself, they've appointed a Baptist pastor as our next archbishop of St. Paul in Minneapolis. On that Friday, he had, typical of Archbishop Flynn, comforting words to say, but also challenging words to say with regard to our gospel and the fact that it calls us to radical love and forgiveness. And I'll never forget one phrase that he said on that Friday, just 3 days after 9/11. He said, "We must ask the question, why do they hate us so much? Why do the terrorists who inflicted that great harm, that great loss of life, why do they hate us so much?" And getting into those questions of examining our own conscience collectively. Of course, nothing would ever justify the loss of one life in response to whatever harm we might have contributed to, much less 3,000, and all of the attendant harm that rippled throughout our country and throughout our world. The other thing that I recall from that day was the singing of America the Beautiful, which we will sing together, and particularly the third verse. And this was the line that struck me, and I'll also mention a part of this same line at the close of my homily. O beautiful for heroes proved in liberating strife, who more than self their country loved, and mercy more than life. And I remember when we sang that, I got goosebumps that day and again last night, because I thought of those men and women who, rather than have that plane crash into wherever it was headed, with thousands of more citizens and lives in the balance, that they took that plane down, sacrificing their own lives. Or those men and women working as first responders going into that burning building, those burning towers, putting their lives on the line. And that is what we also celebrate. We celebrate with gratitude the valor and courage of the men and women who put their lives on the line on 9/11 and in the days succeeding. As in the lives of individuals, so in the lives of nations collectively, we have capacity for good and evil, light and darkness. Sometimes acts of great violence are perpetrated upon individuals and upon nations. Great loss of life, as what occurred on 9/11, must be decried in the strongest possible terms, because every life is sacred, from fetal life in the womb to life along all of life's continuum, to death row, to the person in a coma. Life has inestimable value in God's eyes, and must also in the eyes of all Christians. God is the author of life, and every life is precious and sacred. The fact that so many lives were lost on that day 20 years ago is still, for me and many others, a source of great sadness. The United States has been a source of freedom and good and light in our history. I think of World War I and most of World War II as an example. But as we commemorate this day and the horrific loss of life, we have the opportunity to reflect on how we can better sow seeds of justice and peace, tenderness and mercy, not only within our borders, but also globally. The only path forward for the followers of Christ is living out that radical gospel of love and forgiveness, tenderness and mercy, and also justice. The readings today present a path forward that is sure and steady. As Joe beautifully proclaimed in that first reading, we hear about the suffering servant from Isaiah, the one who suffers out of love for us, and that is foreshadowing, we know, as Christians, Jesus himself, who suffered out of love. And I can't help but think that it's true that the suffering Christ was present in every single person who responded to harm that day, who went up the towers as they were burning. The suffering Christ was present in them and through them. The suffering Christ was present in those who leapt to their death. Think of the abject fear that they must have experienced. And the only thing they could think of to get out of harm's way in the burning of the buildings was to leap to their death, knowing that they would never see their loved ones again, children, spouses, friends. The suffering Christ was with them. The suffering Christ was with that chaplain who put his life on the line, present and ultimately giving his life, and his body ceremoniously and with great gratitude being taken from the rubble and placed almost as an offering on the steps of a church nearby. The suffering Christ is present to all of us in our journey, including and especially when we take up our crosses and follow him. The second reading says it plainly from James. Authentic faith will always manifest itself in good works. It is not private, it's not closed in upon itself. It will always manifest outside of itself to the good of the other. That's what authentic faith looks like, and that is how it can be appropriately measured. Now, we've sometimes been critiqued by our Protestant brothers and sisters that Catholics think that we can earn heaven. We can't earn heaven. We know that. It's a gift of mercy from God, pure and simple. But our authentic response to that in faith will be to follow the example of Christ. That's what faith looks like. Now, how do we put that into place in our modern day? There was an op-ed on September 11th in the Star Tribune, or September 10th, and it said, by acting with mercy and kindness and authentic inclusion, all of those ways, we can lift up a broken and battered world, and certainly by not discriminating based on the color of one's skin or their religion. This is not what it means to be a follower of Christ. And then finally, the gospel today. I love St. Peter. Half the time he gets it right, half the time he gets it wrong. He's enlightened and he's bumbling even in the same passage, right? You are the Christ. Blessed are you, Peter. Your heavenly Father gave you that answer. And then he says, but Lord, you can't do what you just said you're going to do. And he says, get behind me, Satan. And then he says, and he gives the church, his disciples, the ethic that they are to follow. Unless you die to yourselves, pick up your cross and follow me, you cannot be my disciple. And each of them did that in an extraordinary way. All of those men and women on 9/11 did that, and Christ was with them. What we know as Christians and as Catholics is that when we take our crosses and journey with the Lord, the darkness and challenge that we might experience in that suffering is transformed into light and new life. That is the promise of Christ. Now back to America the Beautiful. What I love about this song is it's a petitionary prayer that the course of our country would be aligned with God's will. And as I told our 26 law students on Friday, not in a way that violates the Establishment Clause, but in a way that authentically says God's will is perfectly good. And if we follow God's will, the course of our country will be more humane and more noble and more just. And this is what we hear in the first verse. God shed his grace on thee and crown thy good with brotherhood from sea to shining sea. And then in that beautiful third reading, and we're going to do the entire verse without music at the end. We did that yesterday. This is what the beautiful song and prayer says. America, America, may God thy gold refine, till all success be nobleness, and every gain divine. Catholics, we have a special role and duty to help the words and prayer of that song come to fruition more and more in our day. Please stand.